The Israelites are embarking on a new day. It is a day that generations had longed for with great hope. And it began all the way with Abraham, where God makes a promise. And God's promise had kept them looking forward in anticipation for the day that they would enter into the promised land. And now they were on the threshold. They were almost there. They could see it. But getting to this point hadn't been easy. And it wasn't because God had forgotten them. They had forgotten God. That's a big point. It wasn't because God had forgotten them. They had forgotten God. So for a moment, let's remember what they had forgotten. They had forgotten that once they were slaves in Egypt, and God heard their cries. They had forgotten how God had delivered them from the grip of Pharaoh and rescued them from his chariots and riders. They had forgotten how God had gathered them at the foot of Mount Sinai and established a covenant of relationship. They had forgotten that because they had failed to trust in God, they would have to wander in the wilderness for almost 40 years. They had forgotten how God had provided manna and quail for them during those wandering wilderness years. They had forgotten so much, especially the Shema. O hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. So they are about to enter into the promised land. Moses is preaching to them. He's reminding them. He's trying to it kind of reminds me, when you read that, it reminds me like this parent who's about to let the children fly the nest, but who wants to say, oh yes, and remember, but one more point, but don't forget. That's what we have here, teaching them and Moses is saying, you need to remember everywhere, every day, without exception, the commandments of God, the words of God. Put these words of mine in your heart and soul. Write them on your hand, fix them on your forehead, teach them to your children, talk about them, and write them on your doorposts and on your house gates. Stick them on the bathroom mirror, put them up with magnets on the refrigerator, put them in your daily reminders and your cell phones and apps, have messages emailed to you, do whatever it takes to remember. Don't forget. But the question's why? Why were they required to remember? Was it because history's important? You know, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Is it important to know the facts, or better yet, to learn from them? But how can we? Do we learn from our history? Alex Haley apparently hopes so. He's given credit to have said, unless we learn from history, we are destined to repeat it. There is no longer merely an academic exercise, but may contain our world's fate and our destiny. That's what he said. This point could have, though, different opinions, and it does. Philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel wrote, "What experience and history teach is this, that people and governments never have learned anything from history or acted on principles deducted from it." Two great quotes. Who hold different opinions, who hold out and have this sense of tension that you can feel about the importance and place of history in our lives, and yet our text today is calling for people to remember. Remember your history. But keep in mind, this is not history that's based on fact. Moses is challenging the people not to remember history that's based on fact, but to remember their history that's based on faith. And there's a difference. Now understand, faith, when I say faith, does not mean believing in events that challenge the mind of reason and seemingly go against all laws of nature. That's not what faith is. Faith is not believing in an impossible event actually happen. That's not what faith is. Faith is about believing and trusting in God. Faith is about believing and trusting in God, whose promise is to be with us no matter what. Faith is about living in the dark times, knowing that light is coming. Faith is about being empty, so depleted, but knowing that God is near and is going to replenish and refill us. Faith is about walking down a dead-end street, but believing somehow, some way, a new direction will come. Faith is about walking in the valley that dances with death's shadow and knowing that God is with us. Faith is knowing that even when we cannot see God, God is here. Faith is knowing that when life is beating us down, we are to lift up our heads and to sing our salvation is near. And we proclaim this because we know it's true. And we know it's true because once we were slaves in Egypt. Here we go again. Remembering our faith history and the truth of the past. Big statement here. The truth of our past becomes a springboard of action for the present. Moses is saying to the people, when you get into that promised land, which isn't going to be anything like the wilderness, when you get into that promised land, the land is going to be rich, the crops are going to be ripe, the rivers are going to run with clear water. Life will be good as promised. And that's the danger. Because when you're living in the good times, it's easy to forget to be in relationship with God. Isn't that true? When nothing catastrophic is happening in our lives, especially in our personal lives, it's easy, isn't it, to forget about God? We go through the day as if it's ours, as if the sun rose in the morning just for us. But when catastrophe hits the head of Chicken Little, when the sky is seemingly falling, we are quick to search for God. Where are you, God? I thought you were with me, God. How could you leave me, God? The problem isn't that God has forgotten you. The problem is you have forgotten God, which, interestingly enough, takes us right back, doesn't it, to today's passage. God had never forsaken nor forgotten, but the people had, because they forgot to remember their faith history. Question: how well do you remember your faith history? A history that didn't begin when you were born, but when you were once a slave in Egypt. For this is our history which we are called to remember, because in knowing our faith history, we can experience the awareness of God's presence now. Example: I was visiting with a woman a few years back, and she was telling me about her life, her own personal history. As we all have our own personal history, our own story. She had a difficult childhood, which had evolved into a very troubled marriage. Matter of fact, she went into the marriage hoping that it would rescue her and bring her out of that childhood, but it didn't. It became worse. And she recalled a place in her life of having nowhere to go, nowhere to turn. She said, I was caught between that proverbial rock and hard place, and yet, she said, I got out somehow. And I asked, do you think that's how the Hebrew people told and tell their story? My question caused her to have a look of confusion on her face. I continued, I said, you know, their story is very similar to yours. They were caught between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. And the outcome looked grim. She said, yes, I know the story, which was a polite way of saying, you don't need to tell it. Yes, I know the story, she said. Matter of fact, why is it? Here's just a kind of off the... When someone says to us, now if I've told you the story, let me know. And you do, it doesn't seem to matter. Have you noticed that? Do they just want to know if they've told the story to you before because they're going to tell it to you again? So I just am polite and say, no, I've never heard it before in my life. Never, might as well, exactly, might as well. So she said, yes, I know that story. But what does it have to do with me? Great question. I said, it's the same story. Their take on the story, however, I said, is that God delivered them and they didn't just somehow get out of it. And I would suggest that the same God who delivered them is the same God who delivered you. I dare say you have a story or two like that in your memory bank as well as all. And I invite you to pull them out from time to time. Remember the times. Remember the times when God provided. Remember the time when God renewed and restored and rebirthed you. Remember how God has been with you in every age and stage in your life. And now turn those memories, take those memories, and turn them into confidence and assurance that God is with you now. For if you remember, this is God's promise to us. The call and challenge for today is to remember, not so that we can be just bathed with nostalgia, but so that we can boldly claim God's presence in our lives. A presence that began before we were ever born. For we too are called to continually remember everywhere, every day, that we are to love God with all of our hearts and our minds and our soul. We're called to take these stories, these words of God into our heart and our soul and our mind, not for the sake of yesterday, but for today. This is the reason that we remember those in our midst who have died. In the Spirit of Christ, we love them and they love us. And what makes their memory meaningful is how their lives are now woven into the fabric of the great history. The loved ones that we saw today, how their lives are now woven into the fabric of that great faith history. For in seeing them, in remembering them, we are able to know how God was present in their life and in their death. Their story becomes part of ours, and to God be the glory we proclaim. For in each of their death, we are able and were able to proclaim life. That in the midst of their endings, we are able to celebrate new beginnings. And not only for them, but for us. In our times of gathering about and around their grave, we were able to proclaim the presence of God's resurrecting power and presence. We were able to celebrate the good news of the empty tomb, theirs and ours one day. Remember, remember, remember to remember. Amen.